Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. Today's Friday, which means I'm joined by co-host Duncan Palomortis. Duncan, how you doing, sir?
Good, sir. And as I was telling you earlier, I had the pleasure to quote you eponymously in class the other day. The famous "everybody has blind spots," that Brad says. And I want to remind my students that it's okay, because I had a student specifically who was a little bit guilty, that they didn't remember something that they thought they should remember. And I said, I have a very, very good friend of mine. His name is Brad Wilson. We do a podcast together. And one of the things that he always says correctly, if I may say so myself, he always says that everybody has a blind spot. And he's absolutely right about that. It applies to math. It applies to poker. It applies to life. It applies to everything.
Yep. That's the nature of being a human being.
That's exactly right.
So on this philosophical of days, what do you think is going to be, or what is the topic of conversation today?
Right. We were thinking about this, and then we said, okay, as things keep unfolding, we want to take a break from all the scandals and all the drama, and perhaps talk about something which is related and try to dissect it, the concept of disagreement in general. We're going to ask questions like, what is disagreement in general? What is good disagreement, bad disagreement? What can we learn from it? What do we think about people who don't disagree a lot, people who disagree a lot, and how it relates to poker, things like that.
Yeah, Duncan, we talked about this in the pre-call, that we weren't going to do disagreement and as the topic today.
I totally disagree with that.
All right, let's dive into disagreement, since it's also relevant as it relates. It's relevant most of the time, but especially right now, as the poker Twitter world is burning down and everybody's disagreeing with everybody. I think it's especially pertinent.
Absolutely. And I guess one good place to start, usually the first question is, what is disagreement? Let's be a little bit more specific this time and ask, what is good faith disagreement, in your opinion, as opposed to bad faith disagreement?
Yeah, so I just like to first go to the Google definition because it's helpful. But Google defines good faith argument relies on persuasion to try to convince the other person, whereas bad faith relies on other means, possibly including intimidation or coercion. Would be a good faith disagreement, right? So, you're arguing in good faith that the resolution will be based on some sort of data point that was unconsidered, blind spot that's discovered, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the heuristic I personally use is, focus on the premises or on the rules of inference, like your steps all the way to the conclusion, but not the conclusion itself. Leave the conclusion to the people and concentrate on the premises, concentrate on things you're either comfortable about, you have evidence for some ideas, some thoughts. It can be thought experiments. They don't have to be hard evidence, anything as it pertains.
In a good faith disagreement, I think you learn something, like somebody learns something. There's a net positive from the disagreement, whereas if it's a bad faith, then I don't think there's much learned from such a disagreement, right? Because you're just applying pressure in a way that's outside of the concept.
Absolutely. And to your point, I think you can always learn whether or not, so to speak, even though I don't like to use that word, win the argument, whether or not you win the argument, even though I could argue this is a very bad way of looking at things, because you never win the argument if you actually think you won the argument. Right? You never win the meta game, right? It's not about winning. It's about promoting the truth and improving, like you said.
It's about progress
and
right?
learning. Progress, exactly.
If you can convince somebody of something, you didn't make progress because you're exactly where you started.
Exactly correct. And that was exactly the point. Very good. You pretty much nailed it, right? Exactly. So if you progress either way, because again, if you have an argument and that argument survives the extreme scrutiny of a very good co-discusser, like a person who discuss things, that's you learn something. But if it doesn't survive the scrutiny, you also learn something. So the point again is to progress. There's no such thing as winning in that sense. It's all about finding whether or not something can withstand extreme scrutiny. which
I
and
think
there is a
when the premise does when the premise is winning and losing, I think that's probably the first step to not being in a good faith disagreement, right? That's
that's a good one. Yep.
if the premise is winning or losing, then now we're doing whatever it takes, basically, to quote unquote win the argument, and whatever it takes will oftentimes be outside of just rational logical argument.
I like it. And that reminds me of debates. What is your thought? What are your thoughts on debates in general? Because again, in
I don't
debates,
really have many thoughts on
okay.
debates. I haven't ever really participated in like a public debate. I haven't really ever watched public debates. So I don't really have any opinion.
Got it. I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of it. I like the idea of actually, clearing up an argument, thinking about it, doing preparation. I like all of that stuff. And in quote unquote good debates, people come prepared, and I really like the idea of presenting the arguments clearly. But I think they're just too rigid. Like it's a format which is too rigid for anybody to sort of like change their opinion or agree with certain points and say, you know what, you're right about this, but did you think about this other thing?
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, like I did watch like the presidential debates and the vice president, and those to me just came off as like garbage. I just hated it. It was like they're speaking to very specific people and segments of the population through answering questions, and it's very, very obvious what's happening. And so like it's just not, to me, there was no gain for me watching the thing. It's like, oh yeah, they're just like basically transforming answers into speaking to various segments that carry lots of weight in the presidential election. Which, yeah, that wasn't really very fun to watch.
This is really a good segue, though, because like, what is there to gain, right? I mean, that's a good question. What would you consider a constructive versus a destructive disagreement? And perhaps if you can think of some examples or circumstances, they don't have to be precise examples, whatever comes to mind. Where would you draw the line between a constructive and destructive disagreement? Something you have to gain and something you don't have to gain from.
I mean, I think destructive disagreements generally begin with a premise that each side is solidified in, and there's like there is no point in even having the conversation, because it's like somebody who identifies themselves solely as Republican and somebody who identifies themselves solely as Democrat, right? Them trying to like flip each other in it's just never going to happen, and it's generally just going to lead to anger and fighting, and that to me is just destructive, right? It's like whenever you're arguing about your identity with somebody else and their identity, it's just gonna turn destructive. I don't think that. I mean, it doesn't have to, but generally it will. And then with a constructive debate, it would be, I mean, I guess it would be somebody on the opposite side of the opinion, who you respect, and will bring up good points that might allow you to move away from your opinion as it's held. So there's going to be movement one way or the other with a constructive debate. Like the product is that somebody's going to move, somebody's going to learn. And destructive, I don't think anybody learns, and I don't think anybody's ever moved.
Right. What do you think about that heuristic? Constructive disagreement is any disagreement you have with somebody else, which you might as well have with yourself. It's like talking to yourself.
I don't know. I mean, talking to yourself. What do you mean by that?
No, I mean that, you can consider a disagreement constructive. Sometimes you're thinking about a thing and you have your disagreement with yourself until
sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, because you're talking to yourself, you know that there's no sort of like ulterior motive there. I mean, you really want to get to the bottom of it, right? So what I'm saying is that if a conversation you're having with somebody else, you could have easily had it with yourself.
That's a good that is a good heuristic. Yeah,
a heuristic. Like maybe you can use.
I haven't thought about it that way, but that would be a nice heuristic. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and
the benefit of that, by the way, is just you're getting more data points and more points of the argument from an outside source with a different life experience that may see things a little differently than you do.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, because otherwise is, either a power play, or as a good friend of mine used to say, if we agree on a conversation, we're not discussing, we're gossiping, So it would sort of make sense, that disagreement is useful in order to move forward, because the agreement doesn't cause any sort of change. And which brings me to my next question. In your individual life, right? What role does disagreement play in your life? And I guess what I'm getting with this, and hopefully it's not too loaded of a question, I don't want to lead you in a specific direction, is, how can you use it, disagreement? I'm assuming you can use it to benefit your way, but if not, correct me. But how could you use it if you're using it to benefit you in that way?
I mean, disagreement is a large part of my life. But like, just it's a very big part. With poker coaching, learning, communicating, there's a lot of disagreement that needs to be productive. So like, I think I'm not exactly sure, like the use of disagreement in my life. Could you, I guess, expand on your question
Sure.
so that I can answer?
Yeah. So like, when you're thinking, because many times here in this podcast, we're thinking of a lot of things as tools, like,
Sure.
leadership, right? I mean, it's a way, it's a tool to improve communications, to improve society. Responsibility, again, it can be used as a heuristic, to know our place, and not complain about things that they're under our control, for example, or not complain about things that we don't control, for that matter. We're thinking a lot of the things that we're discussing as tools. So I was wondering, if you were to think of disagreement as tool, and maybe again, maybe you disagree with that, what kind of tool is it, and where do you apply it? How does it show up in your life exactly?
Okay. So I think that there are multiple purposes, multiple use cases, at least for me. I think, there's one that is a disagreement with, say, a student, right? Where I know that I'm right. I think that tool is, whenever that sort of disagreement crops up, it's a tool, because it's a tool. The tool that I use is basically I try to lead them to the right answer in some way. Like, I try to ask questions and allow them to focus, and then maybe throw out the way that they were thinking that was incorrect, that was leading them to maybe a false assumption. So as a teaching tool, I would say that. Now, there's also the disagreement from peers, and even students too, that are very high level, that basically pique my curiosity. The sense is that, oh, that's interesting that they think about things very differently than I do. So when that happens, which is basically my favorite kind of disagreement, by the way, when that happens, I want to inquire as to why. Why are you looking at it this way? Why are you thinking about it? What data points are you considering? What are you prioritizing? Because in those types of situations where something's like super interesting, I know that there very much could be an opportunity for me to get better, and for me to learn something that I was missing, or gain visibility of a blind spot. And then also, it could be the flip side. It could also be true. So basically, to me, I use disagreements as calibration tools to make progress.
Very good. Would you say you are, because we've used that term in the past, in the podcast? We talked about the concept of, I mean, I coined that term, but I think it applies here. The concept of compatibility of disagreement. Would you say that you are trying to integrate the new information into the way you're viewing the world, or is it
I'm
something?
testing it. I'm taking it on a test ride.
Okay.
I'm seeing if it fits and if it makes sense, right? And then if it doesn't fit, or if it doesn't make sense, then I guess there are a few options, right? Then it's like, go further and figure out like where you're getting tripped up, or now we need to reconcile the other side of, okay, where are they getting tripped up? What's missing from their thought process? That's pretty much, yeah, how I would go about it.
That's actually very good, because it brings me to a few questions. The first one is, do you think that there's a unique way of resolution in most of these things? Because again, I mean, if we're talking about poker, things I guess could be different, because we said you're testing it. So does that assume a unique way? Things are either left or right in some sense. Like things are, this is either a profitable play or an unprofitable play. Is there like always a clear dichotomy when we're talking about disagreement here? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, I think like, so I mean, the first answer would be data, in one way or the other, right? And having a large enough sample size to be able to measure a very specific situation, right? And I think that like if there's no agreement, like if the disagreement just persists, then effectively A/B testing and figuring out, just getting a lot of data and a lot of sample on the specific situation, and then kind of get a better sense of what's happening there.
I see. I guess I'm failing to ask the question but that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. What I'm trying to probe into is, do you leave yourself open to the possibility that both of you could be right? But
it depends
okay.
It depends on the situation. Like if the ideas are diametrically opposed to one another, then I think someone is right and someone is not. Like it's binary. Sometimes there are weird things that appear to be binary on the surface, but as you dig into them, aren't so cut and dry, which would basically be like a specific node, that's situationally based, where like, yeah, in some situations you're right, in some situations I'm right. So yeah, I think that understanding like whether or not it's a binary type situation it's another part of
It's another part, the decision tree,
the resolution. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, because again, I guess disagreement plays a different role if we are in binary situations versus non-binary situations, because in a binary situation where something is either true or false, and only true or false, so nothing else, and one person says it is true and the other person says it's false, then clearly one of them is wrong, right? And in that situation, I mean, data can be very helpful. But in situations where, we're talking about gray areas, like for example, broccoli is yummy, which is a sentence that can be true and false at the same time, depending on who's saying it, right?
Because it's again, a subjective statement. Yeah.
Subjective statement, exactly. Or,
I guess that's a part of it, right? Trying to remove the subjectivity into something that's measurable is like the general, in an ideal world, that's what we would be able to do.
So you think that that subjectivity can be removed also from the statement, broccoli is yummy?
No.
Okay. So you mean, so remove the subjectivity when subjectivity is removable?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it. Okay, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I'm actually,
like if we could like objectively poll everybody in the world, and everybody said that broccoli was yummy at like 100%, and I think you could remove the subjectivity, right? And you could just say broccoli is yummy, and everybody would agree because everybody thinks broccoli is yummy.
Right. Until more people are being born, and then we have to run the test again.
Yeah, you have to run it every single day for the rest of the world, and we will know definitively whether or not everybody believes that broccoli is in fact yummy.
Yeah, no, that's really, I actually have another term that I coined in the notes that I'm writing. I call it the locality of the truth, and the reason why it's really funny that you mentioned that, because it's interesting where these conversations are taking us. The idea of the locality of the truth is very similar to that exact subjectivity that you're basically talking about, and sometimes it's removable and sometimes it's not. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because sometimes certain statements have a larger range of spectrum of influence, have a larger range of influence than other statements, and understanding where that spectrum of influence is can actually make a huge difference. And the example, of course, that I give is that people thought that gravity is things are moving down. That's sort of correct if you're inside a room, but then you move on the other side of the planet, and then what's down now became up, so it doesn't work anymore. So it's sort of like, down up works for half the earth. Now you think that, okay, so maybe, gravity is people pulling each other closer, and that was sort of correct until people saw that gravity actually is making light bending. So like that was the Newtonian gravity. And then people, after Newton, when we talked to Einstein, realized that no, gravity is not pulling one object is pulling the other. It's just somehow objects distort the fabric of space, technically of space-time. And now, because now the space has been bent, things are sort of like sliding into it. And that's what gravity is. And that's, as far as we know, that's the best theory of gravity we have up to this day. So the locality of that truth sort of like expands, right? So, and similar with the broccoli example that you gave, if we actually asked a bunch of people, and the survey came back, that 73% of them like broccoli, then that's the truth today, 73%. And that truth expands and contracts as people change their opinion about it. So we have some sort of locality of truth, which, sorry for the long tangent, but I think it's relevant because I don't think that all statements are created equal, right? So there are statements that have
most every statement is like lower T truth.
Exactly right. Yeah, we have lower T truth, exactly. And it's important to understand, but at the same time, it is also important, like you said, if you know something, and you said that earlier, if you know something with your student, you will be doing them a disservice to say, what, it depends. No, it doesn't depend. You know the answer, meta-humility present, and you want to give them that answer, right?
Right. Well, yeah, in a way that resonates too.
Of course.
And that's sort of like the trick of it.
Of course.
And I mean, to be fair, like those, for the listener, the student makeup that would be my least favorite, where we make the least amount of progress, is when they have an opinion that I can objectively say is incorrect, and they are unopen to even considering the possibility that it's underperforming, or that there's a better alternative, or that they're thinking about the situation a little bit incorrectly, right? I think those where, I mean, you just can't make progress with that, where people just double down and dig deeper in the face of evidence too. So I think having an open mind to these types of things make you teachable, and make it to where you can learn and make progress. You just have to be quite careful about where the inputs are coming from, so that you don't agree with everything that's said, because that's its own problem in and of itself.
Absolutely. And it ties back to the conversations we had in the past, that, like you said, not everybody essentially is teachable, right? I mean, and there's only so much the educator can do to help somebody with a new idea, but they need to have the doors and the windows open for that idea to come in, and that's their choice, and there's nothing we can do.
That's why I like that's why I like moving to things that are objective, because like we mentioned, like the identity politics before, right? About how that just generally leads to a bad disagreement. Well, like that's almost entirely subjective, based on, your map of the world and how you view the world. And so like when the disagreement's rooted in pure subjectivity, well, it's very hard to make progress.
Right. And I agree. And that's where we can perhaps talk about good faith of disagreement, because this is why I coined the term compatibility of disagreement, because let's say that we're having a discussion, right? And we're getting to opposite conclusions. I don't want to use identity politics here, so I'm going to stick to broccoli, right?
Yep.
So let's say that do you like broccoli, by the way?
I like broccoli.
Okay,
I don't know that I would call it yummy, but
okay,
I like it.
Okay, I like it too. So because you like it, I'm going to take the other side. So let's say you like broccoli. Let's say I don't like broccoli, and because of that, we get to a different conclusion, which would make sense because we start from a different assumption. To me, that's not necessarily a problem, provided that we understand that exactly.
Provided that one of us doesn't shove broccoli down the other's throat at the end of the disagreement.
Exactly. But also, like, to me, I take it one step further. To me, there's two types of disagreements. We can say, you know what, you think whatever you want, I think whatever we want, and we part days. Or there is a sort of like a deeper connection, still disagreement, but a deeper connection, what I call the compatibility disagreement, that goes something like this. oh, there's people who actually find it yummy. That's interesting. I never thought about that way. I thought because, they were, and of course, it's a very simple example, right? But the compatibility disagreement would be, I understand where you're coming from. If I were put in your shoes, right, I would find it yummy too. But because I was born different, okay, that makes sense. Because I was born in that part of the world, I don't find it yummy. But if I was, like Brad, it would make sense. To me, that's a deeper level of, connection, even though there's a disagreement. That's what I call compatibility disagreement, finding where it is that we're deviating and why, and whether or not that makes sense in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and do you think in general that with that definition, this type of connection, first of all, do you think is possible? And second, do you think is necessary?
I think it's possible for sure.
Okay.
Do I think it's necessary? Depends. I don't know. Like, I mean, as it relates to broccoli, probably not. Maybe it depends on like the topic at hand. I think one thing for me is like, I think disagreements can be draining, both emotionally and just cognitively. And so whenever whenever I'm dealing with somebody that's a high friction person that just disagrees to disagree because they enjoy like arguing or debate or whatever, I just kind of flame out and turn off. So yeah, I think like, I mean, I think it's certainly possible. And I think I can't think of any situation where it's like a net negative or not beneficial, but I would say that, too frequently exploring these types of things can be especially draining.
Got it. And that was actually one of my next questions. Like what's in general your opinion on agreeable and disagreeable people? And of course it depends, but I mean, like first, gut reactions, like
I tend to stay away from people who are disagreeable for disagreement's sake, or disagreeable over things that are just trivial. It's too draining. I don't like engaging with those sorts of humans. I've done it too much in my life where, yeah.
How about the other spectrum, people who agree on everything, the type that always nod whatever you say?
Yeah, that's not great either, because I like I said, I think the fruit of disagreement is progress. I am a fan of making progress. And so like whenever progress can be made and it makes sense, then yeah, I want to disagree because I want to learn and I want to grow. And you don't get that with somebody that just agrees with everything that's said. And two, I think somebody that agrees with everything is effectively implying that their subjective map of reality is exactly the same as yours, which just can't possibly be true.
Right.
Which means that they're just kind of agreeing for agreement's sake. So yeah, I would either extreme. Not really for me.
Yeah, you're not a guy of extremes. I agree with that. I mean, it's but I think there is is it an Aesop story from like the ancient guy who was telling stories, who said, like, he was asking his camel, do you want to go on the uphill or downhill? And then the camel responds to him, like, what happened to the flat street? Do we have to go the uphill or downhill?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I've had students too that have agreed with everything that I've said, but have not made progress.
Yeah, we remember we talked about this, right? Like there's something to be said, something non-ideal about a student who either disagrees with everything or agrees with everything. So there's a healthy dosage of disagreement and skepticism, but at the same time, respect for the person who has been there before, and potentially they have access to more data. That is not to say that you're not both students of the game. It's just that you're next to somebody who might be like a more experienced student of the game, and that counts for something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, that's just
no. Please go.
Well, I mean, it's
just
100% agreement. I think just doesn't facilitate growth, and
Absolutely.
you have to question some things, but you need to be careful about how many things that you question, because questioning everything can drive someone insane.
That's right, and that's a fine line, and it is actually very difficult. And but to your point, it's an excellent point. It can be very draining, which again, maybe for the listener, it's worth repeating that, for those of us, who strive for that disagreement, who are seeking that disagreement, there might be a proper time and place. Like, be ready to discuss about something, right? It's not all the times. And again, when it comes to personal relationships, with your significant other, with your friends, maybe they're not ready to have that disagreement, even if you are. So or when you try to study, there is a proper time and place, and make sure that your significant other, your friend, your co-worker, they're ready to have that disagreement, provided of course that you have that luxury, because there's certain situations where it can be helped. But what are your thoughts? Sorry.
No, well, like, as it relates to like just a lot of things in life, I think that some people will seek people out to change their minds on things that they believe with a high level of confidence in.
Right.
Like conspiracy theorists kind of come to mind, where like they feel like they know something about the world that they need it, that it's very important that they share with other people, and it's very important that the people understand exactly what they're saying and shift their paradigm to what they're saying, which is very grating for people on the outside.
Absolutely.
It's exceptionally grating. And like what tends to happen is there's a disagreement, and the person on the outside tries to convince the person on the inside about their side of the coin. And then basically everything goes to hell in a handbasket, and neither side can really communicate effectively with the other side. I think that, at least in my life experience, as it relates to things of that nature, it's better if you value the relationship, it's better to just not say anything.
Yeah, no, that's and you're bringing a good point, because there is also, like, when you're talking about people who are in the conspiracy theory kind of world, I'm also thinking about those people who actually came back. So in my mind, I'm taking this absoluteness of, I believe in this crazy theory 100%. And I translate it into, well, not everybody believes into that.
Let's say instead of crazy, let's frame it as like low frequency.
Low frequency, yes, but the focus, and this was a poor choice of words, but my focus was that perhaps there is some percentage of rigidity in that idea, and that percentage of rigidity is proportional to not having a discussion, but rather to making essentially a power play. Because when somebody is trying to convince you of something, and it's not a good faith disagreement, that is no longer a discussion. That's a power play, right? It's a completely different thing. So there is a percentage which is a power play.
And it comes from the other side too.
Absolutely.
Not even from it comes from the non-conspiratorial people to the conspiratorial people. And that becomes a power play too.
Absolutely. So I guess the reason why, and again, comes back to you, that you're saying like words are important, and I'm trying to use the proper words so we can communicate. And I like to think of, again, somebody's personality or opinion on a matter as like a pizza, and a certain slice of that is rigidity, so a power play. A certain part of this is just conviction, which is a different thing, on evidence, whatever they see as evidence, right? And the rest of the slice is perhaps a certain open-mindedness. And of course, there's other slices. But if we have these three slices, we can think that for some people, the percentage of rigidity is so big, like you said, it is not worth potentially discussing. But because people have come back from, again, low frequency or like low probability, propositions, perhaps there's people who currently may believe in extreme ideas, but not all is lost, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
maybe they have a wide slice of openness, or
I think there's a question that you could ask that answers this kind of straight from the jump, and is probably an extremely necessary question. So my conversation with Andrew Barber on the podcast, he said, like, basically, if you can ask somebody, what evidence could I introduce that would change your opinion on this subject? And if there is no piece of evidence, there's no smoking gun, there's nothing,
that's rigidity.
then you should not even have the disagreement, like, because there's nothing productive that will come from it, right? So like,
that's a good heuristic. Very good. That's an excellent point. Excellent point.
right. So like, there's too much, as you said, there's too much rigidity. If there's not one piece of evidence that you could provide that would change their mind, then there's no point in having the disagreement, unless you just like fighting with people, in which case I guess you're getting a golden opportunity to fight with people.
Absolutely. And this is also, again, retroactively, this is also another good heuristic for what is a good faith disagreement. You know, like when we're trying to identify if we have a good faith disagreement, we can ask, what is that you asking? And again, sometimes you don't even have to ask it directly. There's so many ways you can know if a person, you know, sometimes they will tell you themselves. I mean, you know, I wouldn't believe that if you came right now and you gave me this, I would change my mind. I mean, sometimes, you know,
well, it can be fairly apparent when they outright reject obvious pieces of evidence.
Right. That can be a good evidence for sure.
It's like a key. It's like, oh, you out like there was a documentary on flat earthers, right? And they ran multiple experiments. They talked to the scientists about the experiments, and the scientists were like, yeah, that'll work, like if they do that, right? And then so they ran the experiment, got the result they didn't want, and then tried to figure out why they didn't get the result they didn't want, instead of accepting their experiment, right?
Confirmation bias, yeah. Right. Trying to basically, yeah.
So basically, there is no piece of information that you could provide to a flat earther to convince them that the earth is not in fact flat. Therefore, having the disagreement is just not productive.
Absolutely. And I would say, again, just because I want to believe that I would say there's not enough evidence to, I would say, most flat earthers. And the only reason why I would replace to a flat earther to most flat earthers is I just want to
there's
leave
a segment,
open.
right? you have to believe that there's a segment that can that can come back in the face of overwhelming evidence.
Exactly. And just, you know, because again, I mean, I know, like I've you know, I never was unfortunate to get into a spiral of a how would you call it, conspiracy theory, but I know as a youngster I've made all sorts of mistakes, you know, that I'm not proud of. And, you know, if I couldn't come back from those mistakes, you know, like that, it would suck if, you know, if I thought that.
I mean, and the thing is, like, some conspiracies could be right?
That's true.
Like they're just because they're low frequency events doesn't mean that they're zero frequency events, right?
Yeah. You spoke like a true open-minded person. So that's it. A true. So I know exactly where you are in the openness when it comes to personality traits. Here's my question to you. What do you think you stand in the agreeable/disagreeable part of the personality trait? Where do you feel you stand on the spectrum?
Could you give me context? So agreeable or disagreeable?
So there is it's a personality trait. You know, it's part of the big 5 personalities, which I believe they're like openness, I can't even pronounce that word, conscientiousness, the extroversion, agreeable, disagreeable, and then neuroticism, which is sensitivity to risk and things like that. So a lot of the poker players can be high neuroticism actually. But anyway, or some can be completely immune. So basically, the question is, how much do you think? What do you think you lean towards? Like, you know, maybe I can give you an example because otherwise it's too theoretical. So agreeable people tend to, you know, prioritize their relationships, and, you know, they're closer to nodding. And I don't mean it in a bad way. They're like, you know, they tend to, you know, they want to make more friends. They want to be more friendly. So they tend to nod it. Disagreeable people will be more skeptic, like they will prioritize skepticism over the opposite.
I am a naturally disagreeable person that's trying to become a convert to being more agreeable over time. I think that's how I would frame it. My teenage self was very disagreeable,
right? Yes.
And just not open to being wrong about anything. I think over time, another part is like picking the battles too, right? Like, sure. I don't always communicate when I disagree on different things, because some fights, or most fights, probably aren't even worth having.
Absolutely. And Brad, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just for the listener, extremely disagreeable people does not mean necessarily assholes, right? And
Sure.
extremely agreeable people doesn't mean naive. It's just like an approach to life. Do you tend to be like the skeptic? It's sort of like,
I'm very disagreeable.
okay,
I would say like I do approach most things with a high level of
skepticism, maybe.
skepticism.
Yes,
Like
me too.
And then I will try to educate myself
Absolutely.
on the thing, but I don't like solidifying false beliefs or things that are inaccurate. Like because that sort of precision is important to me.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so a lot of times it's just like quick trip to Google and Wikipedia and reading multiple sources and just like diving more into whatever area it is where I disagree. And then, yeah, if everything's backed up, cool. Like then I'll be amenable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is, we talked about this today, it is a tool for improvement, right? So by being disagreeable, by pushing back, you're strengthening your ideas in some sense, right? Yeah.
And also like avoiding having a disagreement with this person by first using existing resources in order to educate myself. So I'm not putting the responsibility on them to explain it to me. I'm really putting the responsibility on myself to understand it better.
I love that. Absolutely. I love that. And this is, again, it comes back to the concept of responsibility and to the things that you control, because understanding is the only thing that you control, right? You don't control their understanding, right? So I love it. I love it. Let me repeat that one more time again for the listeners. So you prioritize, you not trying to make them understand, and I'm paraphrasing, but you try to understand it, understand what is it that they're saying yourself.
Yep.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I guess, the conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't tie it, with some of the disagreements that have been happening around us. And what are your thoughts about the disagreement? And I want to be specific. I want to target this question a little bit. What are some instances where you think the disagreement has been used fruitfully? Where are some instances where disagreement has been misused? In any order.
I mean, I think the disagreement being misused would just be when there's the introduction of subjective data points that could just be total noise, and there's no way of really knowing one way or the other. And then the productive ones would be disagreements, but looking at things objectively and trying to get to kind of the root or the truth of the situation through more objective information. And anybody that is 100% convinced in either direction, again, I think that like it feels impossible to be 100% one way or the other in such a vague situation. So anybody that's like starting from the paradigm of, yeah, I'm right and you're wrong, and these are the reasons why, I just don't think that's productive at all, which, unfortunately appears to be the mass majority of people that I see on Twitter.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes I think you mentioned that in one of our private conversations, like sometimes, like there's what I call the 5%, that the 5% of voices sometimes are the loudest, right? And they make 95% of the noise. And there are some people, again, on Twitter that can be really loud. But what would you say are some people that they're worth, give them a shout out, for the way they handled the situation, and they're trying to get to the bottom of it?
I mean, Joey Ingram is like the most obvious one. He's the most obvious. I think that this was a situation that it's difficult to be unbiased.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Joey is the first one that comes to mind, and then like it's just so hard,
Sure. Let me say something while you're thinking, right, about Joey in particular. One of the things that we can learn from it, right? It's amazing to me how well he handled the situation, how he gave the platform to people from all different spectrums. And this is something that he's always been doing. He likes to talk to people. And it reminds me also of people like Joe Rogan, like, people who just like to talk to people. It doesn't matter. And I know people like Joe Rogan have taken a lot of flack for some of their guests. And Joey Ingram is no different, but these are the type of people who are incredibly curious, and they let other people come say their piece, and he does to his best of his abilities. And I would commend him on that. He's trying to protect his guests to the best of his abilities from the craziness that is internet chat. Sometimes he turns it off, and he tries to let them speak. And I think that's very important. I can't stress out how important it is for speech to come out. And I know I sound like a broken record when with free speech, First Amendment, you can, make a meme of it, make fun of me. I don't care. But the fact is that when bad ideas and good ideas compete, it's easier to discern what are the bad ideas. So, and I think Joey does that organically. He lets all these ideas, good and bad alike, to be expressed, and then people can make their own conclusions. And often I think that people tend to make good conclusions.
Right. I think that's a great way to go about it. I think that coming at it from the paradigm of like, you're convinced in one way or the other, then things just kind of go off the rails over time, because again, that's kind of what flat earthers are doing. They're convinced from the jump about the premise. And then once they're convinced, then everything is just about proving the premise right.
Right.
So yeah, like Joey just did a phenomenal job. And I mean, again, this is very difficult. The Solve for Why crew comes to mind. And then Doug Polk is probably the three biggest or loudest voices in this whole thing. And I would say that Joey, in my opinion, did the best.
Right.
That it appeared as if, and I don't know where Solve for Why stands now, but it certainly appeared as if, both Solve for Why and Doug Polk came from the perspective, or were starting from the paradigm that like, she's guilty, period. And then figuring out like how to figure out exactly where she is. And I do think that like, I mean, I don't even know where they stand now, to be honest. They could have completely flipped. I know that like, as the Solve for Why guys specifically were learning more and more, it certainly appeared for a time that they were flip-flopping their opinion on the matter, which I think is quite important. But I have no idea where everybody is at now, because it's too crazy for me, and I just stopped.
I honestly think it's irrelevant, to be honest, and it's irrelevant. Maybe it's not irrelevant in the sense that what's the impact of their conclusion, but their conclusion I think is irrelevant. This is subtle what I'm saying, and I don't know if I can express it correctly. Their conclusion, at face value, is irrelevant. The fact that they're actually making a conclusion is not irrelevant at all. It's going to impact people, but I don't think, and I talked about this last week. I think people with platform should the same thing from journalists. You don't expect journalists to actually go and make conclusions, right? And I think in a situation like this,
but it's so hard to not make a conclusion, because that's what the people want. They want conclusions.
That's right. But I mean, you're not a journalist anymore, right? I mean, you're somebody else. You're like, and I think what we.
By the way, I want to say something
please
important here, is that my perspective, I came out this whole thing from the perspective that she was most likely innocent too, right? So like, even like my opinion on this situation was biased as well, right. Which leads like confirmation for me, like confirmation bias, and trying to prove why I believe what I believe. And like, even like that is not objective. That's sure. Subjective too. So like, yeah, I don't want anybody to think that I'm like throwing somebody under the bus, because like I fall in the exact same camp of, subjectivity and how you look at a situation and then how you think about it.
We all have opinions, and absolutely, yeah. So it's more about a question of whether that specific type of opinion, the conclusive one, right, whether or not that opinion is of value to the community. Definitely has impact to the community, but whether or not
I don't think it has value to anybody. I mean,
I would agree.
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
I think everybody's going to come to their own conclusion, and so like I don't necessarily think that it has value unless of course there's a smoking gun, right? Like in which case then it would have lots of value, because and then nobody would have to convince anybody with a smoking gun. Everybody could just come to their own conclusion based on the evidence.
Exactly, and then again, that's what a smoking gun would be, something that a a journalist would report, right? I mean, this is the type of
Sure.
of a journalist of sorts.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any other thoughts on your mind? I
Nah,
think we covered a lot of ground today.
yeah, we did. It was a great conversation.
As always.
As
Where people can
always,
find us.
all the places, all the places.
You know all the places,
Chase,
people. Come on. How many times do we have to tell you the
yeah. So
places?
subscribe to Chasing Poker Greatness on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is that you love consuming your content. Why Alex Beats Bobby on YouTube, at CBG Podcast on Twitter, and greatnessvillage.com if you want to join the community and have thoughts, questions, feedback, disagreements as to anything that was said based on any of the Philosophical Friday episodes.
And let me give a huge shout out to the village. I mean, some of the things that people are sharing in the community, they're just amazing. Like, huge shout out, like the personal experiences, things that, you guys are an inspiration. I just want to say that, publicly. It's a beautiful thing, and you make, our job so much, so much easier, and it's just amazing. Just come there
not a lot of bad faith disagreements
absolutely
in the community,
absolutely.
which, yeah.
And now you know why I would sit there and I would write 3,000 words. When somebody's in good faith, I'm more than happy to do that all day long. And then they can flame me all day. Like, I know it's coming from a good place. So
absolutely. And that's going to do it for today's show. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Likewise.